Okay, so today we need to talk about managing products, services, and brands. So this is really a lecture on branding, and then we'll also talk about services and the unique aspect of services. And services are an increasingly important part of our economy. And then on Wednesday, we will talk about pricing, and then next week you will have the week to do your test. It'll be on D2L, just like the last ones. So, like people have a life cycle, products have a life cycle, and that depends on the kind of product it is, how long the life cycle is. Coca-Cola has been around for an enormously long period of time. Other products enter the market and then leave rather quickly. How many of you are old enough to remember Beanie Babies? A few of you remember Beanie Babies. Like, those were really popular. People were buying Beanie Babies, and they were paying huge amounts of money for certain Beanie Babies. The Princess Diana Beanie Baby bear was selling, on eBay at one point in time for thousands of dollars. So that's an example of something that, sort of came in and went out fairly quickly. So in the introduction stage, sales grow slowly and you're minimally profitable usually. Usually you have to advertise to stimulate primary demand for your product or service. Now, again, it sort of depends on the product or service, how much you have to do and what kinds of marketing you have to do. So last week we had a sales competition at Love's. That was primarily, we have not ever advertised other than putting up a website for the sales competition. We have primarily developed that service through personal selling, which we'll talk about in the fourth section of our course. But a lot of goods, particularly consumer packaged goods, you have to advertise to stimulate primary demand. Then in the growth stage, you see sales increase rapidly, competitors start to appear in the market, and your profits usually peak in the growth stage of the product life cycle. In the maturity stage, you'll have a slowing of total industry sales. The marginal competitors in the market will generally leave, and profits tend to decline due to pricing competition. And then finally, in the decline stage of a product, sales drop, and companies may delete the product or harvest it. So one of the first products that Coca-Cola launched in order to deal with sort of the diet fads that were emerging in the 1980s was a product called Tab, and they continued to sell Tab until very recently when they finally stopped manufacturing it. But they basically didn't advertise it. It was just because there was a diehard core of people who still drank and liked Tab. Most diet drinks are pretty god awful, and Tab was pretty god awful, but there were people who got used to the taste and liked it and were diehard fans of Tab. So the companies may delete the product or harvest the product and use the money for other ventures. So there are four aspects of this. And the length of the product life cycle doesn't have a set time. As I said, Beanie Babies were one of those things. I don't know, do they still make Beanie Babies? I know you can still buy them on eBay, right, and other websites, but I'm not sure that they still make them. So there's no set time. Some products enter and leave in less than a year. Some products have a long life cycle, like Coca-Cola. I would suggest that Coca-Cola in the United States is in the decline because we've become more aware of the fact that it's not really a healthy product, right? It's got a lot of sugar, a lot of empty calories that are not good for you. But in other places, Coca-Cola in emerging markets has still got probably a very, very long life cycle. So I would suggest in the United States, it's in the decline. At one time, Coca-Cola was the most profitable brand name in the world, and it has been surpassed by some of the technology companies, but it's still an enormously popular and profitable brand. But they've continued to diversify their product offering, as I suggested to you when I showed you the Coca-Cola brands that they have. For example, Dasani water and the vitamin waters, the sports drinks, things like that. So the shape of the product life cycle a lot of times depends on whether or not you're talking about high learning products or low learning products. So if you have something like a Beanie Baby, there's no learning to that, right? It's just a stuffed toy with little, beads for the stuffing. You can have, we take this as the time from launch forward. You can have something that looks like that, or if you're talking about something like Coca-Cola, we're talking about a long life cycle. Even though Coca-Cola is not a high learning product, the product level is important. What's the class or category and variations in those classes and categories? And then life cycle obviously is dependent upon sales. If a company doesn't have enough sales, they're obviously going to go out of business, or the product that they offer will cease to be in the market. So branding scholars like Kevin Lane Keller argue that branding is the most important decision a company will make. And this is very typical of academics, that they have a tendency to be solipsistic, and whatever they are studying, they believe is the most important thing in the world, right? So when I was a political scientist and I taught American national government, I would tell students that politics makes the world go round. And I was always fascinated by students who would sit there and say, I just don't like politics and government, it's boring. Because you can't escape politics and marketing. Like marketing, which is a pervasive social activity, politics and government are pervasive social institutions, right? Everything from the qualification of the person who writes the prescription for my eyeglasses to the depth in which you will be buried and in what is governed by politics and institutions of government, right? So why is it, for example, that in Oklahoma, you have to be cremated? If you want to be cremated, you would think that they could just put you in a crematorian oven and turn the gas on and go to town, right? No, you have to be cremated in Oklahoma in a coffin. Did you know that? Why? Because the cremation services and the coffin companies and the funeral homes got together and lobbied government to insist, the state legislature to insist, that you had to be cremated in a coffin. Now, what that coffin is made of is, it's not like the steel lead coffins that you are buried in, but that's the rule. You have to be cremated in a coffin. So they have these special cremation coffins that they use for that. If you are going to be buried, if you're not cremated and you're going to actually be buried in the ground, you can no longer just be buried in a coffin. They have to bury you in a cement vault. So they have to put a cement vault in most communities. They have to put a cement vault in the ground, and that cement vault is then sealed and goes over the casket. Why is that? Well, I think the rationale behind that is that you can have bodily fluids and deterioration that will leak into the groundwater if you're on, for example, the Garber-Wellington Aquifer. Is that really that big of a concern? Probably not, but that's the law. So you now have to be buried in these cremation vaults. That's an example of how those businesses that sell those have gained effective access to government and insisted that this is what needs to be so that you don't pollute the environment, right? We have lots of things that pollute the environment far more probably, but that's the law. So branding scholars argue that branding is the most important decision a company will make. I would say that's not true because I have taken lots of companies through bankruptcy that had fantastic brand names and fantastic brand images. One that comes to mind in Oklahoma is that I did not take them through bankruptcy, but I'm convinced that they're on the way towards bankruptcy. Chesapeake Energy Corporation, which was started by Aubrey McClendon, right? And they built a huge campus down off of Northwest 63rd and Western Avenue, and they've never made a profit. Had a great brand. As far as I know, they had lots of potential. They had lots of leaseholds. They were trying to vertically integrate their company, and they had huge amounts of debt. And I think they're now selling off the Chesapeake campus. So great brand, fantastic brand image, not capable of producing a profit. So I don't think that's true. I think having a quality product is probably more important. The brand scholars will argue that branding is the most important thing that you'll do. So branding is a major topic of research in marketing. And most of the research in the field is focused on tangible goods and large corporations, which makes it interesting for small corporations or small businesses with regard to branding and most of the research that's been done on this topic. So what is a brand? A brand is a name, a term, a sign, or a symbol that identifies the goods of a particular seller. Coca-Cola is a brand. Now, to gain protection of that brand, you generally go through something called trademark. And those are registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And even though Coca-Cola is an enormously powerful brand, it is largely a descriptive brand, or was a descriptive brand, which means that with regard to trademark protection and descriptive brands, you get less protection unless you can prove that in the mind of the consumer that you have acquired a secondary sort of identification in the minds of the consumer. So brands provide a connection between the good or service that is produced and the consumer. So they make a connection in the mind of the consumer. And if I say certain brands, you get certain mental images in your mind. Like McDonald's, I would suggest to you that the image that most people have of McDonald's is consistent, cheap, and fast, right? It's fast food, although this morning as I was going through McDonald's to get my 2 large cups of coffee, they were anything but fast this morning. I'm not sure what was going on, but that's generally speaking why we go to McDonald's, because they're consistent, they are cheap, and they're fast. Now, with regard to coffee, in blind taste tests, McDonald's actually beats out Starbucks, which is the tool of the devil. I tell students when I take them on sales competitions, when I am the coach of the team that travels with them, I tell them there's 2 things that you're not allowed to say to me unless you want me to punch you in the throat. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to punch anybody in the throat. But literally, if you say Starbucks or Chick-fil-A, those are both tools of the devil. The devil has many tools. I will leave you at the side of the road, right? Because both of those are horrible companies. But they have a connection in the mind of the consumer. What is the connection that Starbucks has in the mind of the consumer? Well, people think it's good coffee, even though in blind taste tests, Starbucks coffee always ranks towards the bottom. And why is that? They actually had internal memos, and this is one of the reasons Starbucks is a tool of the devil, that showed when they first started that they deliberately served really bad coffee because they wanted to get people to, rather than buying a $3 cup of coffee, they wanted to upsell you to a $5 or $6 or $7 at the time frappuccino or latte or something else, right? Besides a cup of coffee. And if you put cream in any coffee, if you whip up enough milk or heavy cream and put it in coffee, it's good. But what you like, I drink coffee black. What you like is not the coffee; it's the sugar and fat from the products that are going into that. So the brand provides a mental connection in the mind of the consumers. What is that? That in the mind of the consumers, even though it's wrong, in my opinion, it's that Starbucks is great coffee. Horrible coffee, shouldn't be drank, but whatever. A brand distinguishes its products or service from other providers. That's the second theoretical part of a brand. So Starbucks is different in a worse way, in my opinion, than McDonald's coffee, right? Actually, in blind taste tests, you know who has the highest rated coffee in blind taste tests of black coffee, if you're talking about black coffee. Anybody want to guess? McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts, not Starbucks. McDonald's and Starbucks, or McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts have better coffee than Starbucks. However, Starbucks has a positive, I don't know why, it has a positive brand image in the mind of the consumer, and that leads to gains in a company's performance, right? Starbucks is viewed as being a hip, trendy kind of, I guess, coffee maker, right? If we talk about Ford or GM, those also have images in the mind of the consumer. What is Ford's image? They're the #1 seller of pickup trucks in the United States for something like 35 years running, right? So people like Ford pickup trucks. Branding can assist consumers as a heuristic in their decision-making process. Because brands acquire this image in the mind of the consumer, it can help us in making our information search shorter. If you are traveling across country, and one of the things that I like to do when I travel cross country is I like to go and visit different restaurants. And a lot of times these mom and pop local restaurants are absolutely horrific. And sometimes they're really, really good, right? But that's not what you get with McDonald's, right? A Big Mac, as I've suggested multiple times in this course, is going to taste the same in Oklahoma City as it is in New York City or in Frankfurt, Germany, when I was a foreign exchange student. The little town that I lived in, which was called Soest, didn't have a McDonald's. And so every time we would go to Frankfurt when the family would go shopping, that was kind of like for them, that was kind of like the way we all go to Dallas to go shopping at Christmas time. They would go to Frankfurt. I would literally run to the nearest McDonald's that I could find, and I would eat like 5 Big Macs in a row because the family that I lived with, the mother was a horrible, German food is not good in my opinion to begin with, and she was a horrible cook. I mean, her idea of cooking was spinach pie, which she took out a block of frozen spinach, threw it in a pie crust, and put some cheese on it, and that was her idea of food. And I was constantly starving to death the entire time I was there. So I would run to McDonald's because it was something that like was all American. And I can tell you that the Big Mac tasted, and the French fries tasted exactly the same as they did in the United States. Now, McDonald's fries have gotten slightly worse. Anybody want to know why they're slightly worse than they were in like the 1980s? What did they fry them in? Anybody know what they fried them in the night? I think I've said this before. Somebody came up in here. Yeah, they fried them in beef talon, which made them like really, really, really like really good. But when they decided that they had to have some vegetarian options, if you fry something in beef talon, you're obviously not a vegetarian option, right? So in developing your brand, Turley and Moore suggests that the following elements are really important to the brand. And you'll find lots of companies, particularly in my first profession, the legal profession, that violate these rules. So it should be short. Why do legal offices oftentimes violate these rules? Well, they usually name themselves because it's a violation of the Code of Professional Responsibility to say, like best lawyers in America, or something like that, right, for your law firm. Because that's a subjective, not objectively verifiable position. So they name them after the partners that found the firm, right? And those can be long. Those names can be difficult to pronounce. My last name, for example, it's a Hispanic name. Most people can't pronounce it. When people ask me how I pronounce my name, I say, do you want like the anglicized version, or do you want me to pronounce it the way that it's supposed to be pronounced? And they'll be like, well, how's it supposed to be pronounced? And I'll roll my R's and they can't pronounce it. So if I started a law firm, which I have a law firm, Aguirre, Morelli and Associates, that's already way longer. Whereas like Coca-Cola is short, right? Coke, it's easy to remember. Easy to spell. Coke is easy to spell. It's short, easy to remember. It's distinctive. It should be distinctive. And finally, this one is the most difficult one to do. Not carry any negative associations. Why is this one difficult to do? Because things that weren't negative in the past can become negative. If you went back in time, so I graduated from Oklahoma City University School of Law. And before I went to Oklahoma City University School of Law, the mascot for Oklahoma City University was the Chiefs. That's what they were called, right? And their emblem of that was a Native American in full headdress. Most professional sports teams that use this mascot, right, have changed. Why? Because as we've become culturally sensitive, we recognize that imagery, the Redskins, for example, professional sports team, right, is got a negative connotation in that identifying people by those physical characteristics is not politically correct. And so they've changed the names of most of these sports teams. Now, interestingly enough, what is, anybody know, Florida State's mascot? Seminoles. The Seminoles. Why are they still the Seminoles? When Oklahoma City University changed, they were the Chiefs. Oklahoma City University was the Chiefs, and they did away with that, and they became the Oklahoma City Stars. Why did they choose the Stars? Well, one of the major buildings on campus, and in fact, it was the law library when I went there, was something called the Gold Star Building. It had a big gold star at the top of the tower on the building, and so they became the Oklahoma City Stars. Why is it that Oklahoma City abandoned the Chiefs and Florida State is still the Seminoles or the Noles? Why can they do that? Oh, I forgot to give you a duck. Sorry. So there are two Seminole tribes in the United States that are recognized by the Department of Indian Affairs, right? There's the Seminole tribe of Oklahoma, and there's the Seminole tribe of Florida. They were one tribe. The Seminole tribe of Oklahoma were the ones that they managed to round up and forcibly remove from Florida on the Trail of Tears, right? They're one of what we call, and this is probably not politically correct today, they're what we call the 5 civilized tribes, right? So what are the 5 civilized tribes? There are 4 C's and an S, which Seminole is one of them. So you've got Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, right? The ones in Oklahoma were the ones that they managed to remove. There's still a Seminole tribe in Florida. These were the tribal members that actually retreated to the Everglades in order to evade forcible removal from Florida. So there's this Florida tribe of Seminole. That tribe, by the way, at one time, I don't know if they still do, but that tribe owned Hard Rock Cafe, right? Which was started, first Hard Rock was started in London. And they own that brand now. The Seminole Tribe of Florida has authorized the state of Florida's school, Florida State University, their state university, to use the Seminoles as their mascot. So it's the reason that all these other teams have started, changing their name, Oklahoma City, from the Chiefs to the Stars, because it's now contained a negative connotation. At the time that Oklahoma City chose the Chiefs, as nobody thought about that as being sort of, culturally insensitive to those groups. So things can pick up over time negative associations. So it should be short, easy to spell, easy to remember, distinctive, and not carry any negative connotations. So things that start out as not having negative connotations may end up having negative connotations and need to be changed. So there are a typology of brands. What are the typology of brands? Now, again, with regard to trademark, if you have a descriptive brand, you cannot get trademark protection unless you can prove that you have established in the mind of the consumer a secondary sort of meaning that is associated. So what is a descriptive brand? Well, and forever and ever and ever, one of the largest copier companies in the world was a company called Xerox. I don't think they are anymore, but they literally undertook a marketing campaign to get people to stop saying, when I was a kid, you would say there were two sort of things that they would do in grade school. They would, the main office in the grade school that I went to had a Xerox machine, and people would say, go make me a Xerox as opposed to a mimeograph. And you all are too young to remember mimeograph machines. These were these machines. They were really cheap to operate, and they used a special type of paper called mimeograph. So teachers would make tests on mimeograph paper. They would then put it on this drum, and then they would spin the drum by turning a handle, and these other papers would come out that were mimeograph paper, and they would reproduce the image that the teacher had made for like a test or a worksheet or something like that, right? So people would say either go mimeograph 20 copies of this or go Xerox copies. And so Xerox actually came out with an ad that said you can't Xerox a Xerox on a Xerox copier, but you can make a perfect image on a Xerox copier, right? So because they did not want their brand to become a descriptive brand for the category of product that they produced, which is copy machines, right? Some brands have become descriptive. We now say when you sneeze, do you need a Kleenex? Right? Kleenex has become sort of ubiquitous for facial tissue. So there are descriptive brands. There are person-based brands. These are often law firms, accounting firms, things like that offer services. And these oftentimes violate the rules of what is a good brand, and that they're not short, they're not easy to spell, things like that. You can have associative brands. So technically speaking, California, and in the United States, they sell stuff that's called California champagne. In the rest of the world, they can't label it that way because champagne is an associative brand. It must come according to the French, from the Champagne region of France in order to be labeled champagne. What is it if it's not champagne? It's sparkling wine, which is when they sell that in other parts of the world, they can't label it as champagne because it doesn't come from the Champagne region. It's not associated with that region, and so it's not part of the associated brands. So what is another example of an associated brand? The International Grocers Association. These are, I'm sorry, Independent Grocers Association, IGAs. These are independent grocers that you'll find oftentimes in small towns that take advantage of the collective buying power so that they can be somewhat competitive with things like Walmart in terms of their purchasing power abilities to negotiate deals. Geographic reference brands, a lot of times you'll see these in banking. So why is Bank First called Bank First? Well, they bought up all of these first national banks across the state of Oklahoma. So Bank First is one of the largest banking conglomerates in the state of Oklahoma. It's geographically all located within the state of Oklahoma. And they started by buying, so there used to be a First National Bank of Guthrie, a First National Bank of Stillwater, and they bought those First Nationals, so that's why they named it Bank First when they bought them all up to change the name so that they would have one brand identity. But generally, like, banks were geographic reference brands because you'd have First National Bank of Guthrie or First State Bank of Guthrie. And then you can have alphanumeric brands where you have a number and a brand name. And some of these will obviously be you know, two types in one. So First National Bank of Guthrie is both an alphanumeric and a geographic reference. How did you become the First National Bank in Guthrie? Well, it was the first nationally chartered bank in Guthrie, Oklahoma. First National Bank of Stillwater was the first nationally chartered bank. The First State Bank of Guthrie was the first state chartered bank. So it's an alphanumeric combined with the geographic reference brand. Once you develop the brand, you've got to manage the brand. And Kevin Lane Keller identifies 10 attributes of brand management that you need to engage in order to keep the brand relevant and in order to make the brand profitable, right? So first is the brand should develop to deliver benefits that customers truly desire. What is it for all of us in this room, with very few exceptions, that we all love about the iPhone? What are the benefits that the iPhone delivers that are things that we truly desire? What do you think it is about the iPhone that makes us want to have the iPhone as opposed to an Android? What?
FaceTime.
I think that's one of the big ones. For a lot of people, FaceTime is a huge benefit, right? It allows you to, if you're, for example, my mother, when my brother lived in New York, it allowed her to see her grandkids on a weekly basis, something that she couldn't do before FaceTime came along or before video conferencing came along, because, you know, that was technology that was unavailable. So I think that's one of the things that Apple does really, really well is their video conferencing platform. FaceTime it's stable. It provides a good image. That camera on this front facing is what allows you to do that, right? And then you can also switch the camera and, you know, show them. And at one point, my mother realized that my brother was using her as a virtual babysitter because he said, "Hey, Mom, the kids want to talk to you." And he handed the kids, they were little kids at the time, the phone, and they're running around the house. And my mother was like, "Where are your parents?" And I'm like, "Oh, they're downstairs having a dinner party." And so my mother realized that she was being used as a virtual babysitter so that the parents could have their dinner party downstairs. So that's one thing. What else is it about the iPhone that is a benefit that we truly desire, that makes it different from the Droid? FaceTime. Yeah.
Just more popular.
It's just more popular. Why is that?
it was, I don't know, it's kind of like, you get like a weird like stigma almost if you have an Android with it.
Yeah, that is among people your age and younger, one of the things, so I was reading this article, a lot of parents would say to their kids, because these devices are more expensive than what you can get other phone devices. And they'll say to their kids, you're not terribly responsible. You drop and break things. Why don't we get you a cheap phone to begin with? And kids absolutely, they will take several generations of iPhones ago in order to meet their parents' price point so that they don't have the stigma of being the green guy on messaging, right? Particularly if you send a group message to people who doesn't have an iPhone, you know it, because their messages show up differently than iMessages. And there is such a stigma. I mean, kids in elementary and junior high and high school are cruel, right? And so you don't want to be the uncool kid who doesn't have the iMessaging. Like, this is a huge deal that Apple has convinced us that we have to have, right? One of the things that I think about, because I'm a lawyer, that is a big benefit to iPhones and Apple, is it's an absolutely secure platform. If your phone gets seized by Big Brother, that's the government, can they get into your iPhone easily? They can't. It's really, really difficult. And Apple will not give them access. I mean, it's nearly impossible, right? So if you're worried about privacy, which most of you are not, and I know this because from time to time students will add me, they'll send me a friend's request on Facebook, and I'll look at their Facebook pages and I'm like, you're a brand. You're your own brands. Don't post these things of you beer bonging, 12 old Milwaukees at the frat house. Like, not a good idea, right? Because somebody will find it. iPhone is really secure. I think that's a benefit that customers truly desire. The brand stays relevant. How does iPhone do that? Well, they actually cannibalize. They come up with new features. We talked about this. The difference between mine and the newest one is there's this stupid button on the new one that allows you to instantly go to the camera or whatever. So the brand is staying, Apple is staying relevant. The pricing strategy is based on customers' perception of value. This is really, really important, right? I wear a Rolex. At one point in time, Sam's Clubs became very interested. Walmart, by the way, is the largest seller of diamonds in the world. Walmart. Now, those diamonds, the quality has varied widely. But Sam's Club, at one point in time, decided that the jewelry market was really an attractive market for them, and they were going to get into this. Now, they have shrunk this considerably. And as part of that jewelry market that they were trying to get into, so Sam's Club actually carried sort of higher and better quality diamonds than Walmart did, right? They had this big jewelry counter in most Sam's Clubs. Now they've shrunk it because among your generation, jewelry is not a big thing anymore, right? But I remember going into a Sam's Club, the one that was on Memorial Road at the time and Broadway Extension, which has now moved to Penn and Memorial, and they actually had a Rolex in the case. I wear a Rolex, right? I have lots of watches. My Rolex is my favorite. I want the all gold presidential model of Rolex, but even used, those are about $20,000 currently, depending on how new the model is, right? And a new one is about $50,000 or more for just the solid gold with nothing else, no diamonds or anything like that on the face, right? So I love my Rolex. So I walked into Walmart, or not Walmart, Sam's, and they actually had a Rolex in the case. Now, how did they get the Rolex? Well, the way they were getting these watches, they have tag cures from time to time in their cases and stuff like that. The way they were getting them is when a authorized Rolex retailer was going out of business, Sam's Club had buyers that were going out and buying up these watches, right? And then putting them in Sam's Club. Rolex went nuts and they locked down and absolutely started mandating that if a authorized Rolex dealer was going to go out of business, they had to sell their product back to Rolex because Rolex did not want to be seen in a Sam's Club, right? Because Rolex prices are high. Rolex does not want to sell watches to everybody. Rolex it's a status symbol, right? Does it keep the best time? No. Mine loses about 5 minutes a month. I have to reset it every month. Now as long as I wear it, it's a perpetual motion. So Rolex developed the first self-winding watch. That's one of the things that made Rolex, right? But Rolex doesn't want to sell watches to everybody. And they do not want to be seen in a Sam's Club. So they went absolutely crazy when this happened. And they now mandate that if you are a Rolex dealer and you're going to go out of business, you have to sell back because their price is based on their perception of exclusivity, and Sam's Club is not perceived as being an exclusive market, right? What is Sam's Club? It's a warehouse. You walk into a Sam's Club and it's basically that's not what Rolex wants. So their pricing strategy, and by the way, Rolex goes up every year over year. They increase their prices by at least about 10% year over year. Why? Because that is their pricing strategy to maintain what they perceive as exclusivity in the market, right? So pricing strategy is based on customers' perceptions of value. And historically speaking, people have thought of Rolex as being a luxury good, a luxury item, right? So the perception is that it's worth the price. You have to properly position. Now, positioning is where your company fits in relation to other competitors in the market, right? And then you have to be consistent. So once you've developed your brand image, you have to be consistent in that message in order to maintain your relevance in the market. So consistency is key. I can give you an example of this in the political marketplace. When George W. Bush ran for governor of Texas before he became president, he was running against the most popular governor in America. Her name was Ann Richards. And they caught on to a little anomaly in the crime statistic. That was that they had only recently, at that point in time, disaggregated juvenile crime from the rest. So they kept crime statistics and they disaggregated those statistics based on the type of crime that was committed. So what are the various types of crime? Well, you can have crimes against persons and you can have crimes against property, right? And so they disaggregated the crime statistics based on whether or not you're talking about rape, murder, assault and battery. Those are crimes against persons or crimes against property, which are burglary, larceny, right? Shoplifting, things like that. Those are the ways that they disaggregated the crime. The crime numbers were dropping for years and years and years as a result of a number of factors, not the least of which was that in 1973, in a case called Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court legalized abortion. And that legalization of abortion actually impacted the crime statistics, because one of the biggest factors of whether or not somebody becomes a criminal is whether or not they're unwanted, right? The legalization of abortion impacts that. So crime was dropping, but they had only recently disaggregated juvenile crime, and there was a blip as a result of that disaggregation, and it appeared that juvenile crime was on the rise. George W. Bush went off script one time during that campaign, and his numbers plummeted. And so Karl Rove took him out to East Texas, and he got it through his head that no matter what you said, you had to say, we must cure juvenile crime in Texas. You could ask George W. Bush what time of day it was, and out would come his stock answer: we must cure juvenile crime. He was the most disciplined politician, and his brand was that he was going to be tough on crime. He was the most disciplined and consistent politician I've ever seen in terms of building his brand image as somebody who was going to be a fighter against crime in Texas. He had Texans believing that there were hordes of feral children waiting to, steal and pillage and plunder the good citizens of the state of Texas. So consistency is enormously important. You have to have a brand portfolio and hierarchy that makes sense. What's an example of this? Marriott. Marriott started out actually as a restaurant company in the Washington, D.C. area. Then they built their first motor hotel, and it was a miserable failure. And so Bill Marriott went to his dad, who had started the company, and said, let me take a shot at running this hotel. And he says, you don't know anything. He'd gotten out of the Navy. He said, you don't know anything about hotels. And he said, you're right, I don't, but you don't either. So what's it going to hurt? Marriott became famous for building big, full-service hotels that offer everything that you can think of, right? So what's a full-service hotel? Well, they have rooms for meetings, they have ballrooms for events, they offer full catering services and restaurants, and usually spas and swimming pools and all of this stuff. Well, then they decided that there was just so many big sort of full service hotels that you could have, and they wanted to expand the market. So they started the first Residence Inn by Marriott in a suburb, right? And what was it to cater to? Well, it was to cater to business travelers and people like that. So Marriott now has a full line of other hotels that cater to everybody at different price points and different needs for people who, for example, need extended stay. They've got extended stay hotels. They've got Residence Inn by Marriott. They've got, Courtyard by Marriott. Why does this portfolio and hierarchy make sense? Well, they're all hotels, right? They're all in the travel and lodging industry. They're not going into, for example, selling, learning management systems or computers, right? Their brand portfolio and hierarchy makes sense. It's all within the same sort of industry and sector of the economy. The brand uses the full repertoire of marketing activities to build brand equity. So they're using everything at their disposal to ensure that what is that? Well, that's with regard to Marriott, for example, it's engaging in a robust customer management system that allows them to know if you are a repeat, if you download, so I'm a Marriott, I like Marriott when I travel. I have their app, it's called Bonvoy, right? I also have the Hilton app. Those are the two brands that I tend to stay at. I have the most points with, I get the best benefits from them. So Marriott and their CRM knows, for example, that I prefer to stay on a high floor when I check in. They, have texting services to ask what I need. So they use the full range of marketing activities to build brand equity. The brand managers understand what the brand means to consumers. They know where their brand is in relation to other brands. The brand is given proper support. So there was a car company that was developed. It was I think owned by GM, called Saturn. You all probably don't remember this because they went out of business. And one of the things that happened was both the most of the workforce of GM and the management sort of ignored this brand. And it was not given the proper support within the corporate hierarchy that it needed to survive, and they went out of business. The company monitors sources of brand equity. This is becoming easier to do. In the past, when I first started teaching marketing 20-something years ago, this was hard to do. You had to do it through surveys of customers, right, which were expensive and timely to collect. How can we monitor that now? It's not that hard to collect information on people, to get them to fill out a survey on their phone, send them a link and a short survey. You can look at what people are saying on things like TripAdvisor and monitor your brand equity. For example, if you're in the hotel and lodging or restaurant business, right? So you can monitor that, and it's easier to do in this environment than it was even 15 years ago, when you had to really collect data that was hard to get from people. That brings us to living the brand. Organizations obviously act through their agents, through their managers and employees. And those agents impact customers' perceptions of the organization. And an organization that gets its agents to consistently project the organization's vision, values, and culture is one that lives the brand. Southwest is an example of this. I will never forget, so when I went into the PhD program, I went from being chief legal counsel and an executive vice president at a publicly traded company where I made over $250,000 a year, to being a PhD candidate at New Mexico State, right? I decided I wanted to go back into higher education. The way I was going to do that, because they had given my job, I was associate general counsel here at UCO, and I was a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. And I left because this company called and they said, we noticed that you filed this trademark and we'd be interested in talking to you about a job. And I said, I'm not interested in your job. I'll pass, thank you. And they said, well, what if we told you that we paid, a base salary of $250,000 a year? And I was like, well, maybe I'm interested, because as associate general counsel at UCO, I made less than $100,000 a year, right? So like all of a sudden I was like, wow, and I have, in the words of my grandmother, she said, Grant, you have champagne and caviar tastes on a beer and weenies budget, right? Because I like horses. I've owned lots of horses. I like airplanes. I like boats. I like anything that goes. Anything that's fast, I like, right? I own 2 airplanes, fly aerobatics, right? Competitively. So, I got this job offer and I was like, yeah, I definitely want to do that, right? Took the job and almost instantly hated it. because it was nothing like what I was used to doing when I was working at UCO, which was I was in a place where there were lots of interesting people to talk to, right? I got to go to lots of different sorts of interesting meetings. I was basically the university's AL